The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the maple trees along Elm Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, had just begun their slow surrender to autumn. I was nursing my second cup of coffee, the cheap store brand that stretched my Social Security check a little further, when the UPS truck rumbled to a stop outside my small ranch house. 67 years of living had taught me to expect little from deliveries. Most packages these days were prescription refills from the VA or the occasional Amazon order I'd placed by accident while trying to figure out Linda's old tablet. My late wife had been the tech expert in our 43-year marriage, handling everything from online banking to those complicated streaming services. Since her passing 18 months ago, I'd been stumbling through the digital world like a blind man in a maze. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through my morning routine. I shuffled to the front door in my worn house slippers, the ones Linda had given me 3 Christmases ago, navy blue with little anchors. The delivery man stood on my small concrete porch, holding a medium-sized box that seemed to shift slightly in his grip. "Harold Patterson?" he asked, though he'd been delivering to this address for years. I nodded and took the package, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to move. Not dramatically, but with a subtle restlessness that settled into my palms like a living thing. The return address made my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite name. Jessica Patterson Morgan, San Francisco, CA. My daughter. The financial consultant who'd moved to California 15 years ago for better opportunities and had been sending Christmas cards with increasingly expensive-looking family photos ever since. I carried the box into my kitchen and set it on the small Formica table where Linda and I had shared thousands of meals. The morning light, filtered through the faded gingham curtains Linda had sewn herself, caught the shipping label. "Live Animals, Handle with Care," was stamped in red letters across the top. That's when the unease crept in like fog rolling off a lake. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Jessica knew I lived alone. She knew about my arthritis, how my hands shook sometimes when I tried to open jars. She knew about the mild heart condition that had forced my early retirement from Local 704, and how the doctor had told me to avoid stress. So why would she send me live animals? The box shifted again, more noticeably this time, and I heard a faint scratching sound from within. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of therapy pet, or perhaps a gift related to the small vegetable garden I'd mentioned during our last phone call, though that had been back in April. I fetched my reading glasses and examined the label more carefully. The sender's address was definitely Jessica's, written in her precise handwriting, but there was something about the way she'd written it that struck me as hurried, almost angry. The H in Harold was pressed so hard into the label that it had torn slightly. I found myself thinking about Jessica's last visit, Christmas 2 years ago, just 6 months before Linda's diagnosis. She'd spent most of the weekend on her phone, talking to clients while Linda tried desperately to engage her grandchildren in conversation. "Dad, you really need to think about downsizing," she'd said during dinner, gesturing around our modest living room. "This place is too big for 2 people. And frankly, it's not exactly building equity anymore." Linda had gone quiet at that, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. She'd loved this house, had picked out every piece of furniture, had tended the flower beds that now grew wild along the foundation. I'd seen the hurt in her eyes, though she'd tried to hide it behind her usual gracious smile. Now, staring at this mysterious package, I wondered if this was Jessica's idea of a solution. The rational part of my mind, the part that had troubleshot electrical problems for 35 years, told me to simply open the box and see what was inside. But something deeper whispered warnings I couldn't yet articulate. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the neighborhood where I'd lived for 26 years. Mrs. Chen was tending her prize-winning roses next door. Across the street, young Tommy Kowalski was loading his work truck. Normal people doing normal things on a normal Tuesday morning. But nothing about this package felt normal. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This story is just beginning, and trust me, you won't believe where it leads. The scratching had stopped, but I could swear I felt a subtle vibration through the cardboard. My coffee had gone cold, and the morning sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the kitchen floor. Whatever Jessica had sent me, whatever message she was trying to convey, I had the strangest feeling that opening this box was going to change everything. I couldn't bring myself to open the box immediately. Instead, I found myself staring at it while memories of Jessica's childhood flooded back, memories that now felt tinged with something I hadn't recognized at the time. She'd always been different from other children in our Cedar Falls neighborhood. While her classmates played with dolls or built forts, Jessica collected things, coins, stamps, even dead insects she'd find in the garden. "It's an investment in learning, Daddy," she'd tell me when she was 8, using words that seemed too big for her small mouth. Linda would laugh and ruffle her hair, but I remember feeling unsettled by the calculating way Jessica would catalog her findings. "She's just practical, Harry," Linda would say during those long evenings when we'd sit on our back porch, watching fireflies dance over the cornfields that stretched behind our subdivision. "Some children dream with their hearts, and some dream with their heads. Our Jessica's got a good head for business." Linda had been proud of Jessica's academic achievements, her full ride to Northwestern, her rapid climb up the corporate ladder in San Francisco. But I'd always wondered if we'd lost something along the way. Some essential warmth that had flickered out during those teenage years when Jessica started seeing everything, including family, as a transaction to be optimized. The box gave another small shift, bringing me back to the present. I realized my hands were trembling slightly, not from the arthritis this time, but from something that felt uncomfortably like fear, which was ridiculous. What could possibly be threatening about a package from my own daughter? I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Jessica's number. We hadn't spoken since Linda's funeral, and our conversations even before that had become increasingly brief and businesslike. She'd call on birthdays and holidays, but always during her commute, multitasking our relationship into the margins of her busy life. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her voice, crisp and professional, instructed callers to leave detailed messages for fastest response. I hung up without speaking. The morning stretched on, and I found myself walking past the kitchen table repeatedly, stealing glances at the box like it might reveal its secrets through sheer observation. Around 10 o'clock, my neighbor Walt Henderson knocked on my front door. Walt was 72, a retired farmer whose wife had passed 3 years before Linda, and we'd developed a comfortable routine of checking on each other. "Morning, Harold," he said, removing his John Deere cap. "Saw the UPS truck earlier. Everything okay?" Walt's weathered face creased with concern as he noticed my expression. We'd known each other long enough that pretending was pointless. "Got a package from Jessica," I said, leading him into the kitchen. "Something about it doesn't sit right with me." Walt examined the box without touching it, his farmer's instincts picking up on the same wrongness that had been gnawing at me. "Live animals, huh? What's a city girl like Jessica know about live animals?" "That's what I'm wondering." Walt had been present during some of Jessica's more memorable visits over the years. He'd witnessed her cold assessment of Linda's garden. "You could increase property value by replacing this with low-maintenance landscaping," and her suggestion that I sell my late father's tools. "Vintage items like these could bring good money on eBay, Dad." "You remember that Christmas when she brought those boys of hers?" Walt asked, settling into one of my kitchen chairs. "She spent the whole time on that phone of hers while Linda tried to teach them how to make cookies. Those kids looked hungry for attention, but Jessica was too busy talking about some big deal to notice." I remembered. Mason and Logan, then 6 years old, had sat at this same table while Linda patiently guided their small hands as they rolled out sugar cookie dough. Jessica had paced the kitchen, Bluetooth headset flashing, discussing market volatility and client portfolios, while her sons watched their grandmother with the desperate attention of children starved for adult engagement. She kept talking about maximizing returns, I recalled. Even made some comment about Linda's recipe being inefficient because it took so long. Walt shook his head. "Some people see dollar signs where the rest of us see family." After Walt left, promising to check on me later, I sat alone with the box and tried Jessica's number again. This time, she answered on the second ring. "Dad, is everything okay? I'm in a client meeting." Her voice carried that familiar tone of barely contained impatience, as if my call was an interruption she was obligating herself to tolerate. "I got your package," I said. There was a pause. In the background, I could hear the murmur of other voices, the rustle of papers. "Oh, good. It arrived faster than I expected." Her tone was neutral, businesslike. "Happy birthday, Dad." My birthday. I'd almost forgotten. September 28th. Linda had always made such a fuss over it, baking my favorite German chocolate cake, inviting the neighbors over for a small celebration. This year, it had simply felt like another day marking time. "Jessica, what's in the box?" Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on an edge I'd never heard before. "Just a little something I thought you'd appreciate. Something that really represents what you deserve after all these years." The words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the September morning. There was something in her tone, a coldness that reminded me of winter ice forming on the Iowa River. "I don't understand." "You will, Dad. I think it's about time you understood a lot of things. I have to go. My clients are waiting." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone in my hand. The box on the table seemed to pulse with renewed activity, as if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive. "Something that really represents what you deserve." Those words echoed in my kitchen like a curse, and for the first time since the package had arrived, I began to suspect that whatever was inside wasn't meant as a gift at all. The scratching inside the box had grown more insistent as the afternoon wore on, accompanied by what sounded like tiny movements against cardboard. My curiosity finally overcame my reluctance around 2 o'clock when the autumn sun slanted through my kitchen window at just the right angle to make the whole scene feel like something from a movie I didn't want to be starring in. I fetched my utility knife from the drawer where Linda used to keep her coupons, the same drawer that still smelled faintly of her lavender hand cream. My fingers worked carefully along the tape, remembering 35 years of opening electrical supply boxes where one wrong cut could damage expensive components. The first thing that hit me was the smell, earthy, organic, like rich garden soil after a heavy rain, but underneath it something else that made my nose wrinkle. The cardboard flaps fell open to reveal another container inside, a clear plastic terrarium with a hinged lid, the kind I'd seen in pet stores. And inside, writhing in what looked like potting soil mixed with decomposing leaves, were dozens of earthworms. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, their pink-brown bodies glistening with moisture. Some were as thick as my pinky finger and nearly 6 inches long. Others were smaller but no less active, creating a constant, subtle movement that made my stomach turn. A small white envelope was taped to the inside of the box, my name written across it in Jessica's familiar handwriting. With shaking fingers, I opened it and read, "Happy birthday, Dad. I thought you might enjoy some new pets. After all, worms eat garbage and turn it into something useful, kind of like what you did with your whole life. That's all you deserve. Jessica." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into my kitchen chair, the letter fluttering to the floor, and stared at the writhing mass in the terrarium. My own daughter had sent me a box of worms for my 67th birthday, along with a note that essentially called my entire existence garbage. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to settle in my chest, a wrongness that went beyond cruel words and symbolic gestures. Jessica was many things, cold, calculating, materialistic. But she wasn't typically this overtly vicious. Her cruelty had always been more sophisticated, wrapped in concern and practical advice. This felt different, desperate almost. I picked up the terrarium and examined it more closely. The worms were ordinary earthworms, the kind used for composting or fishing bait. But something about their behavior struck me as odd. They seemed unusually active, almost frantic in their movements through the soil. I'd helped Linda with her garden for 26 years, had handled plenty of earthworms while digging in the beds, and they'd never moved quite like this. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the terrarium. Walt Henderson's name appeared on the display. "Harold, you doing okay over there? Saw you through your kitchen window and you looked a little pale." I opened the box, Walt. "And?" I found myself struggling to explain. "How do you tell your neighbor that your daughter sent you worms for your birthday, along with a note calling you garbage? How do you articulate the growing sense that something about this whole situation doesn't add up? Can you come over? I could use another pair of eyes on this." Walt arrived within 5 minutes, still wearing his work clothes from his morning chores. He took one look at the terrarium and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. She sent you fishing worms?" "Read the note," I said, handing him the letter. Walt's expression darkened as he read Jessica's words. A retired farmer who'd raised 4 children of his own, he understood family dynamics better than most. "Harold, this is cruel even for her. What's gotten into that girl?" We both stared at the worms, which continued their restless movement through the soil. Walt, who'd been composting for decades, frowned as he watched them. "These worms are acting strange," he said, echoing my own observation. "Earthworms usually move slow and steady, especially when they're disturbed. These ones are almost agitated." He was right. The worms writhed and twisted with an energy that seemed excessive, almost desperate. Several had worked their way to the surface and were pressing against the plastic lid of the terrarium. "You think maybe they're sick?" I asked. "Could be, or maybe they've been treated with something to keep them active during shipping." Walt's farmer's knowledge was vast, accumulated over 50 years of working with soil and livestock. Sometimes bait shops use additives to keep worms lively for fishing. That made sense, but it didn't explain the growing unease I felt every time I looked at the terrarium. There was something about this gift that felt less like an insult and more like, what? A message. A warning. I found myself thinking about Jessica's phone call, replaying her words in my mind. "Something that really represents what you deserve after all these years." And then, more ominously, "I think it's about time you understood a lot of things." What was I supposed to understand? That my daughter had grown up to become someone capable of this kind of casual cruelty. I'd already figured that out years ago, watching her dismiss Linda's gentle attempts at connection, seeing how she treated her own children like portfolio items to be managed rather than loved. Walt was examining the terrarium more closely, his weathered hands careful not to actually touch it. "Harold, when's the last time you and Jessica had a real conversation? Not just those holiday phone calls, but an actual talk." I had to think about it. "Probably at Linda's funeral, and even then she spent half the time on her phone." "She say anything unusual that day? Anything that might explain this?" The memory came back slowly, filtered through the haze of grief that had surrounded Linda's funeral. Jessica had approached me after the service, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "Dad, we need to talk about your finances soon," she'd said. "Mom handled all that, and now, well, you're going to need professional guidance." At the time, I'd assumed she was offering to help. Now, looking at the box of worms on my kitchen table, I wondered if her interest in my finances had been something else entirely. The afternoon light was fading, casting longer shadows across my kitchen. The worms continued their restless dance in their plastic prison, and I found myself wondering what exactly I was supposed to do with them. Keep them as pets? Use them for composting? Release them into Linda's abandoned flower beds? Or was there something else I was missing? Some deeper message hidden in this bizarre, hurtful gift? As if responding to my thoughts, several worms pressed themselves against the clear plastic walls of their container, their movements taking on an almost deliberate quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That evening, after Walt had gone home shaking his head in disgust at Jessica's cruelty, I found myself unable to stop thinking about the worms. I'd moved the terrarium to my small back porch, partly because the sight of them disturbed me, and partly because something about keeping them in the house felt wrong. But even with them outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Jessica's words kept echoing in my mind. "I think it's about time you understood a lot of things." What things? And why now, 18 months after Linda's death, had she chosen to reach out with such calculated malice? I made myself a simple dinner. Canned soup and crackers, the kind of meal that underscored how much my life had changed since Linda's passing. She'd always insisted on proper dinners, even after her diagnosis, dragging herself to the kitchen to make sure I ate something substantial. "Harold Patterson," she'd say with mock sternness, "you're not going to waste away on my watch." After dinner, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went through Linda's old papers. She'd been meticulous about record keeping, maintaining files for everything from utility bills to medical records. I'd avoided dealing with most of it, overwhelmed by the administrative aftermath of losing a spouse. I pulled out the folder labeled Financial and spread its contents across the dining room table. Bank statements, investment records, insurance policies. Linda had organized everything with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. As I sorted through the papers, something began to nag at me. Our financial situation was better than I'd realized, much better. Linda had been quietly investing my union pension contributions for years, building a portfolio that, while modest by Jessica's standards, represented real security for someone like me. There was enough to maintain the house, cover my medical expenses, and still leave something substantial for Jessica and her children. But that wasn't the surprising part. What caught my attention was a series of letters from Jessica dating back to the months before Linda's diagnosis. Letters I'd never seen. The first one, dated 14 months ago, was typed on letterhead from Jessica's financial consulting firm. Professional, impersonal. Dear Mother, I've been reviewing Dad's financial position, and I'm concerned about his long-term care planning. Given his age and health issues, we should discuss transferring some assets to ensure proper estate planning. I've enclosed some information about trust structures that could benefit everyone involved. The second letter, dated 2 weeks later, was handwritten and more pointed. Mom, I haven't heard back from you regarding my previous letter. I really think we need to have this conversation sooner rather than later. Dad's not getting any younger, and if something happens to you first, he'll be completely lost. Let me help you both make some smart decisions while there's still time. The third letter, dated just a month before Linda's cancer diagnosis, was shorter and carried an edge of frustration. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this. I'm only trying to help. Do you want Dad to lose everything to medical bills or nursing home costs? Call me. I sat back in my chair, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Jessica had been pressuring Linda about our finances, while my wife was already battling the early symptoms of the cancer that would kill her. Linda had never mentioned these letters, had never brought up Jessica's concerns about our financial planning. But Linda had done something else. At the bottom of the folder, I found a handwritten note in her familiar script. Harry, if anything happens to me, don't let Jessica pressure you about money. You have enough. You've always been enough. The house is paid off, the investments are secure, and your pension will cover everything you need. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Love, always, Linda. Below that, in different ink, was a later addition. P.S. If she keeps pushing, ask her about her own debts. The twins' private school alone costs more than your entire annual expenses. Sometimes people project their own problems onto others. My hands were shaking as I read Linda's words. She'd known. Somehow, my gentle wife had recognized something in Jessica's sudden interest in our finances that I'd completely missed, and she'd tried to protect me from it, even knowing she might not be around to do it herself. I reached for my phone and called Walt, despite the late hour. Harold, everything all right? Walt, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me if I'm being paranoid. I told him about the letters, about Linda's warning, about the growing suspicion that Jessica's birthday package wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. Harold, Walt said finally, I've raised 4 kids and buried 1 wife, and I've learned that when someone shows you who they really are, you better believe them. Your Jessica showed up at Linda's funeral talking about your finances, and now she's sending you worms with notes about how you're garbage. That's not grief talking. That's something else entirely. But what? What could she possibly gain from treating me like this? Maybe the question isn't what she gains, but what she's already lost. You said Linda mentioned the twins' private school costs. What else might Jessica be struggling with that she hasn't told you about? After we hung up, I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by Linda's carefully organized papers and the growing realization that my daughter might not be the successful financial consultant she pretended to be. The worms on my back porch scratched against their plastic prison, their restless movements suddenly seeming less like natural behavior and more like a metaphor I didn't want to understand. I thought about Jessica's expensive clothes, her luxury condominium, her children's private education. I thought about her husband Derek's startup ventures that she'd mentioned in Christmas cards but never elaborated on. I thought about the way she deflected questions about her work, always speaking in generalities about client portfolios and market opportunities. What if the financial expert in the family wasn't as financially secure as she wanted everyone to believe? And what if sending me a box of worms, creatures that eat garbage and turn it into something useful, was Jessica's way of telling me exactly what she thought I should become? Sleep eluded me that night. I found myself checking on the worms repeatedly, drawn to the back porch by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Each time I looked, they seemed more agitated, writhing against the plastic walls of their terrarium with increasing desperation. By 3 a.m, several had worked themselves into a frothy state, secreting a mucus that clouded the clear container. Something was wrong with them. Walt had been right. Earthworms didn't behave like this naturally. But what disturbed me more than their condition was the growing certainty that their deterioration was intentional. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was making coffee when a silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. Not a car I recognized, but expensive enough to suggest money and success. A woman in her 40s emerged, dressed in a tailored business suit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. "Mr. Patterson, I'm Susan Mitchell from First National Wealth Management." She extended a manicured hand and a professional smile. "I believe your daughter Jessica mentioned I might be stopping by." I hadn't invited anyone over, and Jessica certainly hadn't mentioned sending a financial advisor to my door. But Susan Mitchell's confidence suggested she believed she had every right to be here. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some confusion," I said through the screen door. "I didn't request any financial consultation." "Oh, I understand completely. Many clients feel hesitant at first." She maintained that practiced smile. "Jessica was concerned about your recent situation and thought it might be helpful to have a professional assessment of your options. May I come in? This will only take a few minutes." The word situation struck me as odd. What situation? Living alone in my own house? Managing my own modest finances? Or was she referring to something else? Something Jessica had told her that I wasn't aware of. Against my better judgment, I let her in. Susan Mitchell conducted herself with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to managing other people's money. She spread glossy brochures across my kitchen table and began what was clearly a well-rehearsed presentation. "Your daughter has painted a picture of a gentleman who's struggling to manage independently after a significant loss," she began, her tone professionally sympathetic. "It's completely normal for seniors in your position to feel overwhelmed by financial responsibilities that were previously handled by a spouse." I felt a flash of irritation. "I've been managing my own finances since I was 18 years old, Ms. Mitchell. My wife helped, but I wasn't dependent on her for basic financial competency." "Of course not. But Jessica mentioned some concerning behaviors, confusion about bills, missed payments, that sort of thing. Nothing to be ashamed of, really. It happens to many people your age." This was news to me. My bills were current, my accounts balanced, my financial records as organized as Linda had left them. When had Jessica observed any of these supposed concerning behaviors? Our last conversation had been months ago, a brief phone call where she'd spent more time talking to her children in the background than engaging with me. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully. "I haven't exhibited any confusion about my finances, and I certainly haven't missed any payments." Susan's smile faltered slightly. "Well, sometimes family members notice things before the individual does. Jessica seemed quite concerned about your ability to maintain your current lifestyle. She mentioned that you might benefit from simplifying your financial obligations." There was that word again, simplifying. The same euphemism Jessica had used about downsizing my house. I was beginning to recognize a pattern in the language people used when they wanted to convince you to give up something valuable. "What exactly did my daughter tell you about my financial situation?" "She indicated that you're living beyond your means, struggling with expenses related to home maintenance and medical bills. She thought it might be wise to liquidate some assets while they still retain value, perhaps move to a more manageable living situation." I excused myself and walked to the back porch, ostensibly to check on something, but really to think. The worms were in worse condition than the night before. Several had died, their bodies lying still among the writhing survivors. The smell from the terrarium had intensified, carrying notes of decay that made my stomach turn. When I returned to the kitchen, Susan Mitchell was examining the stack of Linda's financial papers I'd left on the counter. She looked up with raised eyebrows. "These are quite impressive records, Mr. Patterson. Your wife was very thorough. I can see why Jessica might be concerned about your ability to maintain this level of organization on your own." But her expression suggested surprise rather than concern. The papers clearly showed a man whose finances were in excellent order, whose investments were performing well, whose expenses were well within his means. This wasn't the picture of financial distress that Jessica had apparently painted. "Ms. Mitchell, I appreciate your time, but I think we're done here. I haven't requested financial consultation, and I don't believe I need it." She gathered her brochures with less enthusiasm than she'd displayed them. "Of course, Mr. Patterson, but if you change your mind or if your situation becomes more challenging, please don't hesitate to call." After she left, I sat alone in my kitchen and tried to piece together what had just happened. Jessica had sent a financial advisor to my house under false pretenses, claiming I was incompetent to manage my own affairs. The advisor had clearly expected to find an elderly man in financial distress, not someone with organized records and healthy accounts. Why would Jessica lie about my financial condition to a stranger? What did she hope to accomplish? I thought about the worms again, slowly dying in their plastic prison on my back porch. Creatures that eat garbage and turn it into something useful. Jessica's description of my entire life's work. But what if that wasn't the real message? What if the worms themselves were the point? They were dying. Deliberately poisoned or contaminated, sent to me as living symbols of decay and worthlessness. But they were also creating a problem that would require disposal, cleanup, explanation to neighbors who might smell the growing odor of decomposition. A problem that might make me appear unable to care for myself. I called Walt immediately. "Harold, you sound shaken up. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If someone wanted to make it appear that an elderly person was becoming incompetent, unable to care for themselves, what kind of evidence would they need?" Walt was quiet for a moment. Missed bills, confusion about daily tasks, unsanitary living conditions, maybe some signs of poor judgment or paranoid thinking. "Why are you asking me this?" I told him about Susan Mitchell's visit, about Jessica's apparent lies regarding my financial competence, about the increasingly foul-smelling terrarium that was becoming impossible to ignore. "Jesus, Harold, you think she's setting you up?" I stared out my kitchen window at the ordinary street where I'd lived for 26 years, where neighbors like Walt and Mrs. Chen maintained the quiet rhythms of retired life. Everything looked normal, peaceful, safe. But inside my house, a box of dying worms was creating evidence of my alleged inability to maintain basic sanitation, while somewhere in San Francisco, my daughter was apparently telling financial professionals that I was losing my mind. The smell hit me the moment I opened my back door the next morning. What had started as an earthy, organic odor had transformed into something putrid and overwhelming. Nearly half the worms had died overnight, their decomposing bodies creating a toxic soup in the bottom of the terrarium. The survivors writhed weakly in the contaminated soil, their movements growing more sluggish by the hour. I stood on my back porch in my bathrobe, staring at the horrific gift my daughter had sent me, and felt the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just cruelty, it was sabotage. Jessica had sent me something designed to fail, to create a problem that would reflect poorly on my ability to care for myself and my home. My phone rang before I could fully process the implications. Mrs. Chen's voice was polite but concerned. "Harold, dear, I don't want to intrude, but there's quite an odor coming from your backyard. Is everything all right over there?" My heart sank. If Mrs. Chen could smell the decomposing worms from her property, it was only a matter of time before other neighbors noticed. The smell would get worse as more worms died, creating exactly the kind of unsanitary situation that might support claims about my deteriorating competence. "I'm taking care of it, Mrs. Chen. Just a small problem with some garden supplies." After I hung up, I called the number on Susan Mitchell's business card. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that same professional warmth from yesterday. "Mr. Patterson, I was hoping to hear from you. Have you given more thought to our conversation?" "Ms. Mitchell, I need to know exactly what my daughter told you about my situation. The whole truth, please." There was a pause. "Well, she expressed concerns about your ability to maintain your property. She mentioned some issues with cleanliness and organization, and she was worried about your judgment regarding pets, I believe she said. Something about you acquiring animals you couldn't properly care for." The pieces clicked together with nauseating clarity. Jessica had known exactly what would happen when she sent me dying worms. She'd anticipated the smell, the neighbor complaints, the appearance of an elderly man who couldn't properly manage his living situation. And she'd prepped a financial advisor to expect exactly this scenario. "When did you and Jessica first discuss my case, Ms. Mitchell?" "Oh, it was about 2 weeks ago. She called our office specifically requesting someone who specialized in senior financial transitions. She seemed quite distressed about your situation." 2 weeks ago. The worms had been shipped 3 days ago, but Jessica had been planning this intervention for at least 2 weeks. She'd arranged for Susan Mitchell to visit just as the worm situation would be reaching its most problematic state. "And what exactly is a senior financial transition?" Well, it's when we help elderly clients liquidate assets and move to more appropriate living situations. Often it involves working with adult children to ensure the best outcomes for everyone involved. Everyone involved. I was beginning to understand that in Jessica's version of this scenario, my best interests were secondary to whatever financial problems she was facing. I spent the morning researching Jessica's husband Derek and his various business ventures. What I found confirmed Linda's suspicions and Walt's theories. Derek Morgan had launched 3 different tech startups in the past 5 years. All 3 had failed, burning through investor money before folding. The most recent failure, a cryptocurrency trading platform called CoinScope, had been particularly spectacular, losing $2.3 million in client funds before being shut down by regulators. Jessica's LinkedIn profile painted a picture of continued success, but a deeper dig revealed troubling details. Her financial consulting firm had been cited by the California Department of Business Oversight for aggressive sales practices. Several former clients had filed complaints about unauthorized asset transfers and high-pressure tactics. The expensive lifestyle, the private school tuition for the twins, the luxury condominium, all of it was likely built on a foundation of debt and desperation. And now Jessica was looking at her elderly father's modest but stable financial situation as a potential solution to her problems. By afternoon, the smell from the worms had become unbearable. I knew I had to dispose of them, but I also knew that any neighbor who witnessed me throwing away a terrarium full of dead and dying animals would have serious questions about my judgment. It was a perfect catch-22. Keeping them made me look incompetent, but disposing of them would raise questions about why I'd had them in the first place. I was contemplating this dilemma when another unexpected visitor arrived. This time it was a woman in her 30s wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with a county logo. "Mr. Patterson, I'm Sandra Williams from Adult Protective Services. We received a report of concern about your living situation." My blood ran cold. What kind of report? An anonymous caller expressed worry about unsanitary conditions and your ability to care for yourself safely. It's purely routine. We're just required to follow up on these reports. May I come in? I let her in because I had no choice, but I knew I was walking into a trap Jessica had spent weeks preparing. Sandra Williams was professional but thorough, asking questions about my daily routine, my ability to manage medications, my social support network. The caller mentioned something about inappropriate pet ownership, she said as we completed her assessment. Something about animals being kept in unsanitary conditions. I led her to the back porch and showed her the terrarium, explaining truthfully that it had been a gift from my daughter that had gone badly wrong. Sandra examined the dying worms with obvious concern. "Mr. Patterson, I have to ask, why did you accept delivery of live animals if you weren't prepared to care for them properly?" It was a reasonable question with no good answer. Explaining that my daughter had sent them as an insult would make me sound paranoid. Saying I hadn't expected them to die so quickly would suggest poor judgment about pet care. "I think there was a misunderstanding about what the gift actually was," I said finally. Sandra made notes in her folder. "I'm not going to take any action today, but I am going to recommend a follow-up visit in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you'll need to dispose of these animals properly and address any odor issues before they become a neighborhood problem." After she left, I sat in my kitchen and finally understood the full scope of what Jessica had done. She'd sent me a biological time bomb designed to create evidence of my incompetence. She'd arranged for a financial advisor to visit at the moment of maximum crisis. And she'd called Adult Protective Services anonymously to document my apparent inability to care for myself. Everything was falling into place exactly as she'd planned it. Tomorrow, I would have to confront the truth about what my daughter had become and decide how to respond to an attack I was only now beginning to understand. The worms continued their death spiral on my back porch, and I realized that in 48 hours, Jessica had managed to transform my quiet retirement into a battle for my independence, my dignity, and quite possibly everything I'd worked for over 67 years. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of disposing of the worms as Sandra Williams had recommended, I drove to the veterinary clinic on Maple Street where Dr. Jennifer Hayes had treated our family pets for 15 years. If Jessica was going to destroy my reputation with dying animals, I was going to find out exactly how she'd done it. Dr. Hayes examined the terrarium with the focused attention of someone who'd seen her share of animal emergencies. What she found confirmed my worst suspicions. Mr. Patterson, these worms have been deliberately poisoned, she said, her voice tight with professional anger. The soil has been treated with copper sulfate, highly toxic to earthworms. Someone wanted these animals to die, and they wanted it to happen slowly enough that you'd have time to be blamed for their condition. The words hit me like a physical blow. You're certain? Absolutely. Copper sulfate is sometimes used as a fungicide, but in these concentrations, it's pure poison. These worms were dead the moment they touched this soil. The only question was how long their deaths would take. Dr. Hayes carefully collected soil samples and several of the dead worms, sealing them in containers that would preserve the evidence. I'm going to run a full toxicology panel. If someone sent you these animals intending them to die, that's animal cruelty at minimum. Possibly attempted fraud if there was intent to deceive. I drove home with the documented proof of Jessica's malicious intent, but instead of relief, I felt a deep sadness settling into my bones. My daughter, the little girl who used to collect insects in our backyard, who'd once nursed a wounded robin back to health, had deliberately poisoned living creatures to frame me as an incompetent old man. That night, I called Jessica directly. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice carrying the distracted tone of someone handling multiple tasks simultaneously. Dad, this isn't a good time. I'm dealing with a client crisis. I know about the copper sulfate, Jessica. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Cold, calculating, stripped of any pretense of daughterly affection. I don't know what you're talking about. The worms you sent me were poisoned, deliberately. A veterinarian confirmed it, and I have documentation. The question is why my own daughter would commit animal cruelty to make me look incompetent. Another pause, then something that might have been a bitter laugh. You want to know why, Dad? Because you're sitting on $250,000 while Derek and I are losing our house. Because your modest investments could pay for Mason and Logan's education while we're drowning in debt from Derek's failed businesses. Because you're one fall, one heart attack, one senior moment away from needing full-time care that will eat up every penny you've hoarded. The mask was finally off. This wasn't about concern for my welfare. It was about money. My money. So you decided to manufacture evidence that I was already incompetent. I decided to help you understand reality before it was too late. Adult Protective Services doesn't remove people from their homes unless there's clear evidence of self-neglect or dangerous living conditions. Susan Mitchell doesn't recommend liquidating assets unless there's documented need for supervised care. I was just accelerating a process that was going to happen anyway. Her casual admission of orchestrating the entire scheme took my breath away. She'd planned every detail, the poisoned worms to create unsanitary conditions, the financial advisor primed to expect incompetence, the anonymous call to Adult Protective Services to document the manufactured crisis. And if I'd been declared incompetent, what then? Conservatorship proceedings. Derek and I would manage your assets responsibly while ensuring you received appropriate care. Everyone wins, Dad. You get professional management of your affairs, and we get the resources to save our family. Everyone wins except me. You'd have been taken care of. That's more than most people your age can count on. I thought about Linda's note hidden among our financial papers. Don't let Jessica pressure you about money. You have enough. You've always been enough. My wife had seen this coming 18 months ago, had tried to warn me about the daughter we'd raised and loved, and apparently failed to truly know. Jessica, I'm not going to let you destroy my life to solve your financial problems. It's not destruction, Dad, it's transition. You can fight this all you want, but the evidence is already building. The APS report, the financial consultation, the neighbor complaints about unsanitary conditions, one more incident, maybe a missed bill payment or a small kitchen fire, and the pattern becomes undeniable. The threat was clear. If I didn't voluntarily surrender control of my finances, Jessica would manufacture additional evidence until she had enough to force legal intervention. You're talking about elder abuse, Jessica. That's a felony. I'm talking about family responsibility, and good luck proving that any of this was manufactured rather than naturally occurring decline. The worms were a gift that went wrong. The financial consultation was requested by a concerned daughter. The APS visit was prompted by legitimate neighbor concerns. It's all perfectly documented and entirely plausible. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the empty terrarium, now cleansed of its poisoned contents. but still reeking faintly of death and deception. My daughter had just confessed to attempted elder abuse, had threatened to continue manufacturing evidence until she could steal everything I'd worked for, and had done it all with the cold calculation of someone who'd been planning this campaign for months. But Jessica had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I was the same trusting, naive father who'd raised her with unconditional love and support. She'd forgotten that I was also a man who'd spent 35 years troubleshooting complex problems, who'd served in the Navy, who'd navigated union politics and workplace challenges that had honed my ability to think strategically under pressure. She'd poisoned the worms, but she'd also poisoned herself, because now I knew exactly who my daughter really was, and I had documentation to prove what she'd done. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The next morning, I sat across from Detective Maria Santos at the Cedar Falls Police Department. Dr. Hayes's toxicology report spread between us like evidence of a crime I still couldn't quite believe my own daughter had committed. Detective Santos, a woman in her 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every family horror story imaginable, studied the documents with professional thoroughness. "Mr. Patterson, what we have here is clear evidence of animal cruelty. The deliberate poisoning of live animals. That's a Class C felony in Iowa. But you're alleging something more serious, elder abuse through systematic deception and attempted financial exploitation." "I have recordings," I said, placing my phone on her desk. Jessica admitted to orchestrating the entire scheme. She confessed to planning the Adult Protective Services call, coordinating with the financial advisor, and deliberately sending me poisoned animals to create evidence of incompetence. Detective Santos listened to the recording of Jessica's confession, her expression growing darker with each damning admission. When it finished, she sat back in her chair and shook her head. "In 20 years of police work, I've seen adult children steal from elderly parents in every way imaginable. But manufacturing evidence of incompetence while simultaneously committing animal cruelty? That's a new level of calculation." The investigation moved quickly once it began. Detective Santos contacted Adult Protective Services, revealing that the anonymous complaint had come from a California phone number registered to Jessica Patterson Morgan. Susan Mitchell, when confronted with evidence of the premeditated scheme, admitted that Jessica had specifically requested an advisor who specialized in urgent senior transitions and had provided detailed talking points about my supposed financial incompetence. But the most damning evidence came from Jessica's own digital trail. Police obtained warrants for her phone and email records, revealing a months-long campaign of research into elder abuse tactics, conservatorship procedures, and methods for documenting senior incompetence. She'd Googled, "how to prove elderly parent incompetent," "substances toxic to earthworms," and "anonymous reporting to Adult Protective Services." The case attracted attention beyond Cedar Falls when word leaked that a successful financial consultant had attempted to frame her elderly father using poisoned animals. The Iowa Department of Aging launched an investigation into what they termed one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes they'd encountered. Jessica's professional life collapsed within days. The California Department of Business Oversight suspended her license pending investigation. Her financial consulting firm terminated her employment immediately upon learning of the charges. Derek's latest startup venture lost its remaining investors when news of the family scandal broke. But perhaps the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: her own children. Mason and Logan, now 12 years old and old enough to understand what their mother had done, called me directly. Mason's voice was shaky with emotion as he struggled to find words. "Grandpa Harold, we saw the news. Mom told us you were sick and couldn't take care of yourself anymore. She said that's why we couldn't visit you after Grandma Linda died. But that wasn't true, was it?" "No, Mason, that wasn't true. We wanted to see you. We missed you and Grandma Linda so much. But Mom kept saying you were too confused to have visitors, that it would upset you." Logan took the phone from his brother. "Grandpa, we found some of Mom's emails. She wrote to Dad about how much money you had and how they could use it to save the house. She called you terrible names." My heart broke for these boys who were discovering that their mother was capable of cruelty they couldn't comprehend. But it also swelled with relief that Linda's grandchildren, the ones she'd tried so hard to connect with during those painful Christmas visits, still remembered her love. "Would you boys like to come visit me in Iowa? We could plant some flowers in Grandma Linda's garden." The silence on the other end was followed by the sound of quiet crying. "Really? Mom said you never wanted to see us again." "That was another lie. I've always wanted to see you, both of you." The legal proceedings moved through the system with systematic efficiency. Jessica was charged with multiple felonies: elder abuse, attempted fraud, animal cruelty, and filing false reports with government agencies. The evidence was overwhelming, her recorded confession damning, her digital trail comprehensive. Derek, facing his own financial crimes related to his failed businesses, agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony revealed the full extent of their financial desperation. Over $400,000 in debt, the luxury condominium in foreclosure, the twins' private school demanding payment of overdue tuition. Jessica became obsessed with your father's financial situation after Linda died, Derek told investigators. She kept saying he was just sitting on money while we were losing everything. She researched elder abuse cases for months, looking for methods that would work without leaving obvious evidence. The case went to trial 6 months later. I testified about the poisoned worms, the manufactured complaints, the systematic attempt to destroy my reputation and independence. The prosecutor called it a calculated assault on an elderly man's autonomy by the person who should have been his greatest protector. Jessica's defense attorney argued that she'd been motivated by genuine concern for my welfare, but the evidence was too comprehensive to support that narrative. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Patricia Williams, herself the daughter of an elderly father, delivered a scathing sentence: 5 years in prison for elder abuse, 2 additional years for animal cruelty and fraud charges to run concurrently, full restitution for my legal expenses and the veterinary costs, and a permanent restraining order preventing any future contact. Ms. Patterson Morgan, Judge Williams said, you attempted to rob your father of his dignity, his independence, and his financial security through a scheme of breathtaking callousness. You poisoned innocent animals and manufactured evidence of incompetence in a calculated attempt to steal everything he'd worked for during 7 decades of life. The sentence of this court reflects society's commitment to protecting our most vulnerable citizens from the very people who should be protecting them. As the bailiff led Jessica away in handcuffs, she turned to look at me one last time. The expression on her face wasn't remorse or apology. It was pure hatred. In that moment, I understood that the daughter Linda and I had raised and loved was gone, replaced by someone whose greed and desperation had consumed every trace of human decency. But sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by the friends and neighbors who'd supported me through the darkest months of my life, I also felt something Linda would have been proud of: the quiet satisfaction of justice served and dignity preserved. The months following Jessica's sentencing brought a peace to my life that I hadn't experienced since Linda's death. The house on Elm Street, which had felt cavernous and lonely after my wife's passing, began to feel like home again as I reclaimed the rhythms of independent living that Jessica had tried to convince everyone I'd lost. Mason and Logan came to visit that summer, spending 3 weeks with me in Cedar Falls. Derek, facing his own legal consequences but genuinely remorseful about his role in the scheme, had agreed to shared custody arrangements that included extended visits with their grandfather. The boys were different from the distant children I remembered from those awkward Christmas visits: more open, more curious, hungry for the kind of steady adult attention that Jessica's chaotic lifestyle had never provided. "Tell us about Grandma Linda again," Logan asked one evening as we sat on the back porch where the terrarium had once held Jessica's poisoned gift. I'd replaced that space with 2 chairs and a small table where the boys and I shared evening snacks and stories. "She would have loved having you here," I said, watching Mason carefully tend the small vegetable garden we'd planted together. "She always said this house felt too quiet without children's voices." "Why didn't Mom let us come before?" Mason asked, his 12-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of things. Even before she got in trouble, she always had reasons why we couldn't visit. I'd struggled with how to answer this question, wanting to be honest without destroying whatever relationship the boys might eventually rebuild with their mother. Sometimes adults make decisions based on their own problems instead of what's best for their children. Your mom was dealing with things that made it hard for her to think clearly about family. "She told us you didn't want us here," Logan said quietly. "She said you were too sick and confused to have visitors. But you're not sick at all, are you, Grandpa?" "No, Logan, I'm not sick. I'm getting older and I move a little slower than I used to, but I'm not sick." The boys spent their days exploring the neighborhood with the freedom that small Iowa towns still offered. They made friends with Tommy Kowalski's children, learned to fish at the pond behind the elementary school, and helped Walt Henderson with his chickens. Most importantly, they experienced the kind of stable, loving environment that Jessica's financial desperation and Derek's failed businesses had made impossible. Mrs. Chen became an unofficial grandmother to them, teaching them to identify the different roses in her garden and sharing stories about her own grandchildren who lived too far away for regular visits. The entire neighborhood seemed to embrace these children who'd been deprived of extended family connections by their parents' dysfunction. "They're good boys," Walt observed one evening as we watched Mason and Logan build a fort in my backyard using Linda's old gardening supplies. "You can tell they've been hungry for this kind of attention." "Linda would have spoiled them rotten," I replied, thinking of my wife's unfulfilled dreams of being the kind of grandmother who baked cookies and told bedtime stories. She always said Jessica was too focused on achievement to let her children just be children. The Adult Protective Services case was officially closed, with a finding that I was fully competent and living independently without any need for intervention. Sandra Williams, the caseworker who'd been forced to investigate Jessica's false claims, stopped by to apologize for the intrusion and to commend me for exposing what she called one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes her department had encountered. "Your case is going to change how we investigate anonymous complaints," she told me. "We're implementing new protocols to verify the legitimacy of concerns before conducting home visits. Too many people like your daughter have learned to game the system." The financial impact of Jessica's attempted fraud was minimal, thanks to Linda's careful planning and my own conservative spending habits. The legal fees were substantial but manageable, and the settlement from Susan Mitchell's firm, which had agreed to pay damages rather than face a malpractice lawsuit, more than covered my expenses. More importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment again. Jessica's systematic campaign to undermine my confidence had been more effective than I'd initially realized. For months after Linda's death, I'd second-guessed every decision, wondered if I really was becoming forgetful or incompetent. The validation that I'd been right to be suspicious, that my instincts about Jessica's motives had been accurate, restored a sense of self-assurance that I'd feared was gone forever. I began volunteering at the senior center, sharing my experience with other elderly residents who'd faced similar pressure from adult children. My story became part of an educational program about recognizing and preventing elder abuse, helping other seniors understand that family members could be perpetrators as well as protectors. "The hardest part," I told one support group, "is accepting that the person trying to harm you is someone you raised and loved. But protecting yourself isn't betraying them, it's refusing to enable their worst impulses." The house itself underwent subtle but meaningful changes. I converted Jessica's old bedroom into a proper guest room for Mason and Logan's visits, painting the walls a warm blue and adding twin beds with quilts that Linda had made but never finished. The back porch, once contaminated by dying worms, became a peaceful reading area where I worked through the stack of books Linda had always meant to read. Walt and I developed a routine of evening walks around the neighborhood, two widowers who'd found companionship in shared experience and mutual support. Our conversations ranged from practical matters like home maintenance to deeper questions about aging, family, and the challenge of maintaining dignity in a society that often wrote off elderly people as burdens. "You know what impressed me most about how you handled Jessica?" he asked one evening as we paused to watch Mrs. Chen's roses catch the last light of day. "You didn't let her cruelty make you cruel. You could have destroyed her publicly, could have used those recordings to humiliate her completely, but you focused on justice, not revenge." "Linda wouldn't have wanted me to become bitter," I replied. "She always said that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick." As autumn returned to Cedar Falls, bringing the same golden light that had illuminated the morning Jessica's package arrived, I found myself grateful for lessons I'd never wanted to learn. I understood now that love and family weren't automatically the same thing, that protecting yourself from harm sometimes meant protecting yourself from the people who should love you most. But I also understood that healing was possible, that new relationships could grow in the spaces left by damaged ones, and that dignity, once reclaimed, could become a source of strength rather than vulnerability. The worms were long gone, their poisoned remains properly disposed of, and their toxic message transformed into evidence of justice served. In their place, Mason and Logan had helped me plant bulbs that would bloom next spring, a garden that Linda would have loved, tended by hands she would have cherished, growing in soil that was finally free of deception. 2 years have passed since that September morning when Jessica's package arrived at my door, and I find myself living a life that Linda would have recognized and celebrated. The house on Elm Street remains my home, but it's no longer the lonely shrine to memories that it became after Linda's death. It's a living space again, filled with the sounds and scents of an active household during Mason and Logan's regular visits, and maintained with the care of someone who plans to stay. The boys, now 14, have become young men with deep roots in Cedar Falls, despite living most of the year with Derek in California. Derek himself has proven to be a better father in crisis than he was in prosperity, taking a steady job as an accountant after his entrepreneurial dreams collapsed and focusing on providing stability for his sons. Our relationship, once strained by his complicity in Jessica's scheme, has evolved into something approaching mutual respect. "I should have stopped her," he told me during his last visit to drop off the boys. "I knew what she was planning wasn't right, but I was so desperate about our financial situation that I convinced myself it was necessary. I'm sorry, Harold, for all of it." Derek's apology, offered 18 months too late but genuine in its remorse, helped close a wound that had festered since Jessica's arrest. Not all family relationships can be repaired, but some can be rebuilt on new foundations of honesty and mutual understanding. Jessica herself remains a closed chapter. She served 3 years of her 5-year sentence before being released on parole, but the restraining order prevents any direct contact between us. According to Derek, she moved to Phoenix after her release and works as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. A dramatic come-down from her former life as a high-end financial consultant, but perhaps a more honest reflection of her actual capabilities. The boys ask about her sometimes, struggling with the complex emotions of loving someone who committed such calculated cruelty. I've learned to navigate these conversations with the same patience Linda showed when dealing with difficult family dynamics, focusing on their emotional needs rather than my own sense of betrayal. "Do you think Mom will ever say she's sorry?" Logan asked last Christmas as we sat in Linda's kitchen making the sugar cookies that had become our holiday tradition. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I know that your happiness doesn't depend on her apologies. You can build a good life regardless of what she chooses to do with hers." Mason, always the more analytical of the twins, nodded thoughtfully. "It's like that garden we planted. The flowers don't need the weeds to apologize for trying to choke them out. They just need good soil and enough light to grow." At 14, he'd already developed a wisdom about relationships that his mother never achieved. Both boys had learned through painful experience to recognize the difference between love and manipulation, between family support and family exploitation. My own life has expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark months after Linda's death. The senior center volunteer work led to a position on the county's Elder Abuse Prevention Task Force, where my experience with Jessica's scheme has helped shape new policies and educational programs. I've testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger protections against financial elder abuse, and my story has been featured in AARP publications as a warning to other seniors about family-perpetrated fraud. "You've become an advocate," Walt observed during one of our evening walks, as we discussed my latest speaking engagement at a statewide conference on aging issues. "Linda would be proud of how you've used this experience to help other people." Walt himself has become more than a neighbor. He's the brother I never had, the constant friend who shares both daily coffee and deeper confidences. His own journey through widowhood has paralleled mine, and together we've created the kind of mutual support network that makes aging in place both practical and meaningful. Mrs. Chen, now 83 and still tending her prize-winning roses, has become a grandmother figure to Mason and Logan, teaching them patience and attention to detail through gardening lessons that often extend into life philosophy. "Plants teach you to think about tomorrow," she tells them. "You plant today what you want to harvest next season." The house itself reflects this forward-looking perspective. I've made practical modifications: grab bars in the bathroom, better lighting in the stairways, a medical alert system that gives the boys peace of mind, while maintaining the character that Linda loved. The back porch, once contaminated by Jessica's cruel gift, now holds comfortable furniture where I read morning newspapers and evening novels, surrounded by thriving plants that the boys and I tend together. The financial security that Jessica tried to steal through fraud has been preserved and even enhanced through careful management and modest growth. Linda's investments continue to perform well, providing not just for my current needs but ensuring that Mason and Logan will have educational opportunities regardless of their father's financial recovery. More importantly, I've learned to see my resources as tools for building relationships rather than assets to be hoarded or protected. I contribute regularly to the senior center, support local youth programs, and maintain college funds for the boys that will give them choices their parents' financial chaos never allowed. The psychological healing has been more complex but equally significant. I've learned to trust my instincts again, to recognize the difference between reasonable caution and paranoid suspicion. The therapy sessions that initially focused on processing Jessica's betrayal evolved into broader conversations about aging, independence, and the challenge of maintaining dignity while accepting appropriate help. You survived an attack on your fundamental autonomy, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, my counselor, explained during one of our sessions. The fact that you not only defended yourself but used the experience to help others shows remarkable resilience. That resilience has been tested in smaller ways over the past 2 years. Minor health issues, home maintenance challenges, and the occasional moment of forgetfulness that comes with aging all could have triggered the anxiety Jessica's scheme was designed to exploit. Instead, they've become opportunities to practice self-advocacy and appropriate help-seeking. When I needed cataract surgery last year, I arranged my own care, coordinated with neighbors for temporary support, and managed my recovery without surrendering any independence. When the furnace failed during a February cold snap, I researched contractors, obtained multiple bids, and made informed decisions about replacement options. These mundane victories might seem insignificant to younger people, but they represent the difference between competent self-management and the manufactured incompetence Jessica tried to create. As I write this, sitting in Linda's kitchen on a morning very much like the one when Jessica's package arrived, I'm struck by how completely my life has been transformed by events I never could have imagined. The attack that was meant to destroy my independence ultimately strengthened it. The daughter who tried to steal my dignity became the catalyst for me to claim it more fully than ever before. Outside my window, Mrs. Chen tends her roses with the same patient devotion she's shown for the 26 years I've been her neighbor. Tommy Kowalski's children play in the street with the carefree abandon that Mason and Logan have learned to embrace during their visits. Walt approaches my front door with 2 cups of coffee and the newspaper, ready for our morning ritual of discussing everything from local politics to grandchildren's achievements. This is the life Linda and I dreamed of when we bought this house, planted these trees, invested in this community. It's a life built on genuine relationships, mutual support, and the kind of dignity that can't be manufactured or destroyed by others, only claimed and maintained through daily choices to treat yourself and others with respect. The box of worms is long gone, but their message has been transformed. They were sent to represent what Jessica thought I deserved: decay, worthlessness, disposal. Instead, they became the catalyst for something better: justice served, family relationships rebuilt on honest foundations, and a life lived with purpose and connection. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on your screen. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the doorways to our best lives, if we have the courage to walk through them with our dignity intact. The morning light streams through Linda's gingham curtains, illuminating a kitchen where 2 14-year-old boys will soon be making pancakes with their grandfather, where genuine love has replaced manufactured crisis, and where an old man has learned that family isn't about blood, it's about choosing every day to treat each other as worthy of respect, protection, and care. This is what I deserve. This is what we all deserve. And this is what I'll spend whatever years remain to me protecting and nurturing, one day at a time.